Hello, and welcome to the Haaretz podcast. I'm Josh Leifer, a columnist here at Haaretz, filling in for our usual host, Allison Kaplan-Summer. We are recording on Wednesday, July 28th. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu flew to the United States, where he met yesterday with U.S. President Donald Trump before attending the funeral of the late Lindsey Graham. Amid the ongoing negotiations with Iran over a potential end to the war, which many feared was set to reignite just last weekend and which Netanyahu still might hope to restart, Israel's election campaign continues. In today's episode, we are going to talk about the state of ultra-Orthodox politics and society in this especially turbulent period. Political debate in contemporary Israel has, to no small degree, revolved around issues relating to the ultra-Orthodox. For many in the anti-Netanyahu camp, ending the ultra-Orthodox draft exemption has become one of the central driving demands. Yet the fight over the draft is just one of the many flashpoints, we might say, between the ultra-Orthodox and the non-ultra-Orthodox publics in Israel. Understanding what is happening in the Haredi world is essential for understanding what is happening in Israel more broadly. Our guest today is Penina Pfeiffer, CEO of the New Haredim and a Jerusalem-based activist. Penina, thank you so much for making the trip here to Tel Aviv.
My pleasure.
So I think one way to start is by asking, who are the New Haredim? I think our listeners probably know about Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. They may even know the difference between Hasidim and Litaim, non-Hasidic or Lithuanian ultra-Orthodox Jews. But who are the New Haredim? Does this describe a distinct sociological grouping, a political constituency? What does it mean?
That's a great question, and I'm going to do my best to answer it as succinctly and clearly as I can. It's like a whole lecture on its own. But basically, you have three distinct Haredi subgroups, which are represented by political parties, each of them. There's the Sephardi Haredim, which are represented by Shas, and then there's UTJ, which is really comprised of two separate parties, Degel HaTorah and Agudat Yisrael, the Hasidic and Lithuanian or Yeshivish, however, parties, and they're Ashkenazi. And then from all these people, which is today over 1 million people, maybe 1.2, I don't know the exact number, nobody does, but so we'll say 1.2 million. Out of that, there's a certain percentage, and it's on a scale, of like how new Haredi are you, how old Haredi are you. It's like, there's different ways to measure it, but there are two. There have been surveys and academic work done, a lot of it by my friend Dr. Nahumi Yaffe of Tel Aviv University, and basically it shows that there are actually sort of 4 Haredi subgroups that if you divide it by sort of not by affiliation, by communal affiliation, but rather by sort of lifestyle or sociology. So you have what you would call the new Haredim or the modern Haredim, which is they're each about 25%. And then you have, the really hardcore. Then you have people who are sort of more Israeli, but they're still not modern. They appreciate the state, but they're also very much in their communities, and they're less inclined to be to ask a rabbi everything, but they're still very much within, the community's guidelines. And then you have people who are sort of neither here nor there, they're sort of nihilists, and they're in the sense that they don't think the state is a sort of authority, and neither is Haredi society. They're just doing their own thing. So it's fair to say that let's say if you take the spectrum, I'm very liberal Haredi, right? So I'm on the end of that spectrum, and then you have all kinds of, and I'm also politically affiliated. Anyone who Googles me will know that I'm a feminist and a leftist and yada yada. I have to say that this division does not have any bearings on right wing or left wing. This has to do with how liberal you are in your lifestyle. Like, will you go to college? Will you go to the army? Will you be employed within the wider Israeli society, etc.?
But just so our listeners understand, what we're really talking about is the newness. I mean, it's kind of funny because, like, in some ways, the essence of Haredism, Harediyut, is like is resistance to the new. So to say like Haredim Hadashim is kind of our new Haredim. There's I think maybe an intentional kind of humor, almost like a ironic element to that name. But what it essentially we're talking about are people who are living in many ways lives that are not so dissimilar in terms of work and consumption habits from their non-Haredi neighbors, but who are maintaining a strictly halachic lifestyle and belonging to ultra-Orthodox community.
Yes. I'll also say that in Hebrew, the name of the organization is Hatzibur Haredi Mamlechti, which is not new, but it doesn't translate into English. And the term that English speakers are familiar with already from, past iterations was the New Haredim. So that's why when I
Interesting.
Represent or speak about it in English, I just use the New Haredim because that's something that people understand in some way. If I try to say, I don't know, state Haredim, but the reason it's called the Tzibur Haredim Mamlechti because Mamlechti means citizenship, full citizenship, meaning Haredim as full citizens with, full obligations and rights, which is different from the way both conceptually and politically Haredim are organized today in Israel, meaning you have political representation, but sort of everything, and it's moving more and more that way. Like even for your medical care, right? In Israel, you have nationalized healthcare. You have these like subplots of like going through the Haredi system, like everything, and schooling and all kinds of things, but even things you wouldn't expect, banks, whatever. So we're like trying to like undo that idea that a Haredi citizen is in any way different, like that they deserve to get their goods and services through a second party.
Right. I think this is actually really good for us to lay the framework for our listeners before we get into the political dates, because in some sense it's the background for a lot of this. But basically what it sounds like you're saying about the organization, also its goals, and it's is that there is this, in some ways, a paradox, we might say, or this is my analysis, a paradox at the center of Israeli Haredi politics, which is that on the one hand, doctrinally, the Haredi parties are either agnostic or at times antagonistic to the concept of sovereignty and the state. On the other hand, they are not just in the political system, they are kingmakers in the political system and have created something that people often refer to as a kind of autonomous communal structure that has everything from schools to healthcare clinics to all different kinds of
supermarkets, newspapers,
exactly.
Music,
everything. And in some sense, and we're going to get to the political stuff in a minute, but in some sense, what's happened is that arrangement, that paradoxical setup, has for a lot of reasons become unsustainable. Do you think that that's an accurate description of what has happened?
Yeah, I think that the main reason it's unsustainable is because it was set up for a small minority, and we've become a large minority. We're still a minority, but a very large one, both in percentages and numbers. And that kind of setup works for a small minority. It doesn't work for millions of people. I'll also say that most Haredim are under the age of 20. I think 24% of all school children in first grade in Israel are in the Haredi school system. So that tells you a little bit about where we're heading and why it's so important to actually address what Haredi politics are. Like, until a decade ago, no one ever surveyed Haredi political opinion. Political surveys are done usually at the behest of political parties that are trying to garner votes, right? So why would I care what the man on the Bnei Brak street thinks? It doesn't matter. He's going to vote for, or she is going to vote for a Haredi party, and that Haredi party will make a deal, a coalition deal of whatever it is. The man on the street, that their opinion matters less than other people because we know what they're going to vote for. And only 10 years ago, when things started to shift and this new Haredim type of, shift happened, that's when politics, like the political polling started. It started actually not as political polls like for votes. It was the Israel Democracy Institute, the Pew Institute. They wanted to know like where Haredim stand.
And so they discovered that this kind of diversity existed within the community, and also discovered the nature of like the political challenge that was arising from.
They discovered that young Haredim, not also older ones, but like the younger you go, the more right wing, which is a reflection of Israeli politics in general, but an extreme reflection. That the leadership, Haredi leadership, even now, because they've been there forever, they're still the old guard, they're still moderate. I would never categorize them as left wing. Some people like, it's not, but they're moderate. Not when it comes to religion and state issues, but when it comes to like other things. And the young people in the Haredi community are not.
The work that you're doing is to try to, it sounds like, make the case for a, let's say, a Haredi identity that takes its relationship to the state not as something to kind of ignore or push off, but as something that actually, has to be taken seriously and even positively.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing on my end. I'm trying to make it sort of like a bilateral kind of obligation. The state should also be taking Haredi citizenship seriously and not, foisting it onto like different NGOs and all kinds of like arrangements that they make with political parties or whatever it is. People end up without options, without choices, and then there was this whole idea for a while that was sold also to liberal American Jews who donated a lot of philanthropic funding for, Haredim, they can leave yeshiva and then we'll fix their education problem within 2 years, and they'll go to college and everything will be fine. And it wasn't fine, and everybody knows now because the reality and the reports all point in that direction. So, for example, one of our flags is that we want to make sure that boys, especially because girls' education is more similar to what we consider regular education, not to allow that anymore.
Let's go back to the man on the B'nai Brak Street for a minute, because I think that for the last, I guess, several years, the central issue that has arguably been closest to bringing down the current government coalition has been the attempt to re-legislate a new draft exemption. Currently, military-age ultra-Orthodox men don't serve in the army, and the previous legal arrangement that made that possible was overruled by the court, and then the government had to pass a new one, and hasn't been able to do that. As a result, there's something of a kind of social crisis has emerged in the Haredi world in Israel because of the consequences of the failure to re-legislate or formalize the draft exemption for ultra-Orthodox men. And at least from reading the Haredi press, although not the party-controlled one, but the more robust public sphere that's developed, it seems like there's a lot of discontent, anger at the existing leadership, anger at the non-Haredi parties, frustration with a reality in which people who have outstanding draft orders might get stopped on the way to the airport or can't leave, or there's all these kinds of stories that circulate as someone went to report that on a theft in his community, and actually he got arrested by the military police when he went to the police and because he had an outstanding draft warrant. Can you kind of break down what's happening for us as a result of this political debacle, and then maybe we can get into some of what the political consequences of that might be?
Haredi men are not exempt; they're deferred.
Right, that's
forever and ever.
Indefinitely deferred.
Haredi women are exempt.
Deferred in the sense because basically how it works is that as long as they are enrolled in yeshiva, they get a deferment because they're currently enrolled.
And then at a certain age they're no longer. Yeah, so it's de facto it's an exemption, but de jure it's a deferment. So it's kind of, Israel has an emergency law that's been in place since, I think, its inception, since, the War of Independence, 1948, that basically calls for, draft, everybody has to be drafted at the age of 18. And historically, there's, the deferment and exemption and all that. And sometime in the 70s, when the right wing came into power, they brokered a deal where basically Haredi men altogether stopped serving in the army, which has always been contentious within Israeli society for obvious reasons. I don't think it needs to be explained. Equality, my kid dies, your kid doesn't. We don't like it. But here we have like a convergence of the two unfortunate, we had October 7th, when at the same time, the past, every time they have to renew this kind of renewal legislation that sort of bypasses this law for Haredim. And so these two things happen together. And now, there's a lot of anger at the Haredi community and also within the Haredi community, because the Haredi community has never, they've never really suffered the consequences, meaning the politicians and whatever rabbis, everyone, they took care of the problems somehow. And they lived with that. That was like the deal. Like, we send you to the Knesset and you take care of this. That's our main job. They have two jobs, not one job. They have two jobs. This is one. The other one is getting funding for yeshivas. Those are their main jobs. Like, that's why people want them there. And they're connected, right? They're interconnected. That's, by the way, one of the reasons I think that Haredi men are not exempt, because if you exempt them, then you're going to have like an issue with getting the funding. It's like a whole political setup. So now people are actually living it, like you said. They can't leave the country, or they might get, stopped by military police if they run a red light or whatever it is. So they're very frustrated. And again, Haredim don't, especially the Haredim that, are not willing to negotiate with the draft, they live very much outside of mainstream Israeli society. Like, they don't know how to navigate this whole thing, like what the army is or who to talk to or what to do or what the options are. They're not being given options. Like, if you're in yeshiva and you try to negotiate something and your rabbis find out, then you'll get kicked out. Right. So they're sort of trapped within this problem and no one's solving it for them. And they're getting a lot of hate because everyone else is like, what is wrong with you people? There's a war for 3 years, we're sending our husbands and our
hate from the rest of Israel.
Yeah, both on the right and on the left. Right. Even though like the coalition is, sort of trying to find the solution and whatever, their constituency is mostly, not everybody, because there are some people who are like okay with it, but there's a lot of anger. So they're living with both of this, and like they have no idea how to deal with it.
Do you think this is going to have an effect on the share of votes that the Haredi parties will win in October? I mean, for a long time, I think there is, and I'm sure you've been, you've been part of some of these. Like, there's been conversations about starting a new Haredi party that would be independent from the rabbinic establishment of either the Sephardi or Ashkenazi communities, and kind of put forward a new kind of Haredi politics. There has actually been a new party that launched called Hatzibur Haredi, or the Haredi Public, which is not actually campaigning to be like its own independent party as much as it seems to want to win representation within the existing lists. What is going on with this attempt to challenge, or maybe not challenge, the monopoly on the Haredi vote that Shas and UTJ have?
Look, both Shas and UTJ have a certain amount of votes that are ironclad.
They're not going anywhere.
They're not going anywhere. That's it. But they also have votes that are, they each have votes that are not. They're a little bit different. With Shas, it's like traditional people who don't necessarily live a Haredi lifestyle, who, if Shas, let's say, turned left at this point, would go back to the Likud or maybe go to Ben Gvir. In UTJ, it's more people who are frustrated, or maybe also political ideologies, but mainly people who are just frustrated with them. I'll say this. 4 years have passed because this government completed its course, which is very unusual in Israel. And that means a lot of new Haredim became 18 in that time. So they should grow. So even if they don't grow, that's a loss. And from what I understand, they're a little bit worried that they might even lose a little bit, lose a mandate or two or something. Obviously, I can't predict what will happen on election day, but they're definitely worried about it. And yeah, there's this new party that's trying to capitalize on this frustration, and they're sort of like more citizen-minded in the sense that they're willing to maybe negotiate with the draft, and they want Haredim to have jobs and all that. They do not have any women on their list, and they're marketing themselves as basically Haredim 2.0, meaning like we'll fix a little here, we'll fix a little there, but we're we're same old. So I think they're looking to take votes from the Haredi parties, from people who didn't vote last time, who are Haredi but didn't. Basically, the rebellion within Haredi parties usually expresses itself a little bit in voting for right-wing parties, and more than that, just staying home.
Interesting.
Because Haredim are very good at getting out the vote, so those who stay home, that's sort of like
that's their protest, because there aren't so many other vehicles for
right.
That.
But let's say in Beitar, you can get 10% of a right-wing vote. I mean, I can't tell you exactly what their goals and aspirations are, but obviously they're not going to pass the threshold. And they're not going to get into the Haredi parties. That's not happening. I know there's like a laundry list for each of these parties of people who have been, they wait their turn. It's very organized. You don't just like skip the line.
So these upstarts basically are not going to be there. It's not going to.
No. They don't even think so. Like unless they're high on their own supply. No. So I'm assuming they're going to campaign and try to get themselves into one of the right wing parties, Likud or further right. I'll say this, and I hope our listeners take it to heart. I really, really hope that no liberal party lets a party that doesn't allow women within its ranks to join it. I'm a little bit tired of liberals sort of forgetting liberal values when it comes to Haredi women and representation. So please don't do that.
No, I mean that's a good reminder, because one of the things that's also, I mean, the draft people focus on the draft, but they'd focus on other things but one of the big changes, and also this is related to how we started with the new Haredim, is there is a struggle within the Haredi world over women's leadership in civic life. I mean, and also in higher education, of course. Like we're coming, for those who maybe weren't following Israeli legislation, we're coming off one of the bills that the current Haredi leadership got in the end as part of their deal with the right was a law entrenching or providing for gender segregation in higher education.
Yeah, it already exists in undergrad, and now they're trying to expand it to graduate and doctoral. I'm one of the petitioners against that law.
I think for listeners abroad, the passage of this kind of law comes out of left field. Like, why now? Why are they doing this? And what does it mean?
In Israel, you don't have segregated academia. That's the baseline. But then there was this wish for Haredim to be more integrated into the workforce, both women and men. It started with women. And, there were mainly feminists who petitioned against it. But basically, the higher court allowed it. And they cited two reasons. They said there's a cultural and educational gap that needs to be overcome, and we're going to allow it. I think the results of that decision were overall good. Mm-hmm. Like it allowed, especially for women, right? For Haredi women. Haredi men couldn't really take advantage of it because it's segregated doesn't mean you have the education to succeed. So they're a different issue. But either way, it's been sort of a push towards it for a while. And now in this very right-wing, very religious government, you have a lobby for the Haredi and religious woman, something like that. And it's basically what we call Chardal, like the far religious right, not Haredi women. Maybe there's one or two Haredi women, but it's mainly national religious, but very far right religiously and, politically, that are leading this. because the Haredi parties have never sanctioned academic studies.
Interesting. So you're saying basically for people who maybe aren't familiar with this communal demographic, it's hard to explain what their ideology is, but like there is a point at which the religious Zionists, the most religiously strict wing of the religious Zionist movement, think of themselves as, like we said, Haredi Leumi, national Haredi, but not in the Mamlechti sense, but in the like nationalist sense. The Haredi party's official statement is we don't go to secular education because we don't support it, and so it had to come from a different place, basically.
Right. So Shas voted on the law, and UTJ left. They didn't, vote for or against it. So basically, my position, which I've had to explain over and over since I petitioned, is that the idea of undergraduate degree is to open the door, but it's supposed to open the door into the world, not into like sort of Harry Potter style, like going from one place to another and never like actually integrating. So, and it's also just a question of where you draw the line, because everybody draws the line somewhere, right? Like, let's say the official representatives of UTJ. First of all, a lot of their staff studied the same, the same degrees I did in the same university I did, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, public policy, whatever. So obviously they don't need it. But it's also, right, they sit in the Knesset with women. So you're drawing the line somewhere. Right. So I think the line has to be drawn here. Also for practical, like financial reasons, it's going to narrow the scope of how many degrees are open to Haredi men and women, because obviously you can't offer all the...
You can't duplicate everything twice.
You're going to have a few options, and they're not going to be offered by the universities. The universities are against it. It's going to be offered by colleges, which are not publicly funded.
Are private.
Are private, so they're going to want to make money. So they're going to want to stuff as many people into these programs as possible. And then the Haredi community being built the way it is going to sort of create this whole mechanism around it to, shovel people into these programs. And I can just see it happening.
And the thing that was supposed to allow, like you said, for openness and for integration into Israeli society becomes another avenue for reinforcing the walls against the outside and keeping people.
Yeah, it's not just gender segregated. It's also, it's segregated from all other types of Israelis. Like, I don't think that in a program that's only for women, they're going to have, Bedouin women.
Probably not.
Probably not.
Although, probably not. To go back to, so we've talked a little bit in the background here about drift to the right among young Haredi voters, and you wrote an article 4 years ago, I think, hard to believe, about the radicalization that was happening, let's say, on the margins of the Haredi world, and especially among young people. And I think it's something that maybe people not in Israel aren't so familiar with, but that Ben Gvir's party, Otzma Yehudit, does pull some disgruntled voters. There have been like predictions that a party like Otzma Yehudit would draw a lot more Haredi support, and that actually hasn't happened so far. But at the same time, like, we do know as an observable phenomenon that there is a kind of far-right Haredi street movement that is in the Ben Gvir camp, and maybe even more right-wing. I mean, this is now a tangent, but I was reading an article on, I think, on one of the Haredi news sites, and a advertised poll popped up. And I was like, okay, I'm curious. I clicked on it, and it turned out, as I went through the questions, that it was a poll that was fishing for an electorate that wanted to put issues of, kind of merge issues of land, Eretz Yisrael, with the usual Haredi basket of issues about education and that kind of thing. And we do see other parties that have emerged recently that are gesturing towards picking up some of this fringe Haredi, Chardal, extreme vote. I'm thinking of Moshe Feiglin and Michael Ben-Ari's party, who, they're explicit Kahanists more so than maybe Ben Gvir these days, because Ben Gvir, in order to be legalized, had to disavow in some sense. I'm curious how this process of extremism or radicalization has changed in the years since you wrote that article, which I think people can find in English on 972. And I'm also curious, though, how October 7th has impacted that process. And on the flip side, the fight over the draft, because in some ways the nationalization or the nationalist politics is in tension a little bit with the draft thing. I mean, we also probably all have seen interviews with people who are on the one hand like extremely right-wing nationalist views about what should happen in Gaza, and on the one hand don't believe that they should serve in the military. I mean, that's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, but I'll leave it there. And
Okay, so I'll say this: I became an activist about over a decade ago. My first article was in Haaretz, and it was also about this. That was the first thing I wrote, and I had no data to support me because it was before people started doing the surveys and polls. So I asked a friend who was doing his master's at Hebrew University and happened to be, he happened to do a thesis on this. So I asked him for his data. And I published it, and I went on a campaign trying to convince everyone on the, center left that they have to deal with this, and you have to reach out to the Haredi community, because you're going to find out when the old guard changes that you're going to find it's going to be like the floor dropping out, like politically, because all of a sudden the Haredi parties are going to become very, very, like you're just going to have right wing, right? It wasn't a very successful endeavor, as you can tell. Also, reality dictates, like there's nothing more powerful for any political movement than just being in the government. Like Haredi children, not just Haredi children, but my children. And the reality is that they know the Haredi parties are always in a right-wing coalition, and that Netanyahu is always the prime minister. Like that's anyone under 20, that's just the reality with a blip here and there. So that's all they know. And then you obviously had the intifadas, and you had, like there's no shortage, and now we have a war. So I think what I would say October 7th did change is that you have kind of this dual reality, because again, you're sitting in the government and supporting a war, et cetera, but you're not willing to participate in it, and you consider the army to be like, off limits. Obviously, there's a range of reactions from those who will, pray for the soldiers and be very supportive, to those who will say terrible things about them. But either way, the actions stay the same. No, right. People aren't being drafted. First of all, Haredi youth is now, they're outlaws. Like,
why?
Because they're
because they have outstanding draft.
Yeah. So you have like, I don't know, tens of thousands of outlaws. Like it's in the literal sense.
80,000 draft orders have been issued over the last several years.
Right. So you have a lot of people who are living outside the law. That has an impact on people. Not a good one usually. So that, sort of distances you from the state. There's also that shift, like to just disengage and become more like on the fringes and connect to the ideologies that are not what we call mainstream Haredi representative, politics, but rather like the more masharim, which we didn't discuss, but like those who don't engage with the state at all, they don't vote in elections, they don't want to take money from the state, right? They don't recognize the state, they see it as this evil entity.
So that's one direction of people becoming more sort of even more insular.
Right. So there's that extreme. And then again, these are all very young people, and in 10 years, I don't know what's going to happen, but right now. And then you have this very, people are frustrated, right? And they're outside the law, and et cetera, and they're being told all the time that it's because of the left-wing higher court and the Yoam Mashit. I don't know how you say that in English.
The Attorney General.
The Attorney General. And like, she's become like a demon, right? And like, so they're constantly like, I think the most popular news channel for Haredi people, they're not watching it on TV, they're getting it on their phones on like these Haredi channels, but it's basically channel 14 translated into like going into their brain all day. Like Yinon Magal is like a superstar for Haredi boys.
That's pretty depressing.
But it's true. Yeah, it depresses me too. But nevertheless, my kids don't know who he is, thank God. They're taking that frustration and, blaming it on the left, even though the government is right wing, right? It's ridiculous, but it works. So they align with this like Ben Gvir and super right wing ideology. So you have these two reactions, and then you have, I think, a lot of kids in the middle who don't know what's flying. They just know that there's a problem.
What's a positive change that you think that amidst of all this darkness that we might still see?
Okay, it's a little bit of like a Leninist thing to say, you know, in order for
We
things
love
to get
Leninism.
better, then it gets worse first. I will say the Haredi community is very young. We're still going to see a lot of changes. It's not going to be static, but things don't happen on their own. Like, people have to be intentional with their policy, with their philanthropy, and it's important to realize that, you know, American Jewry invests a lot in Israel, and they should, you, my listeners, should educate yourselves about who you align with when you're coming to Israel, and who you want to be, you know, associated with, work with, and just, you know, learn about it. Because what happened was that a lot of liberal funding and good intentions ended up where we are now, and it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't. It can go another way. And also, if this government, please God, changes, and let's say Eisenkot is prime minister, I personally believe that one of the Haredi parties, probably UTJ, will be part of his coalition. And even though that might sound frustrating to a lot of people, I think it's positive, because it will teach Haredim that this is also an option.
I think that is a great place to end on that ray of hope. Okay, so Penina, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was fascinating to talk with you, and hopefully there will be good news in the not so distant future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz podcast. Thank you to my guest, Penina Pfeiffer, and to producer and editor, Adi Shacham. If you want to continue to watch or listen to the podcast and make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe and follow Haaretz.com.